All right, so I think we have the initial arrivals, everybody here. So let me welcome you to not the last talk of the semester, but the last talk before the Thanksgiving break. There are more center events after the break. Edouard could not be here, so I am introducing our speaker for today. And it is my pleasure to introduce Tony Beavers. He's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Evansville. And he was also the founding director of their very successful cognitive science program there. And I've known Tony for a number of years from my time in Indiana. But it's great to have him back in contact and extended exchange while he's a visiting fellow at the center this semester. Tony works on issues related to ethics, technology, and AI. He's written widely on these topics. He's the editor of a recent Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbook on Philosophy and Technology. I first met Tony through the Computing and Philosophy Association meetings, actually at CMU, where the conference was being held. He's past president of what became the International Association for Computing and Philosophy, and he's long been active in bringing various kinds of digital projects to philosophy, including a dedicated search engine called Noesis, which relied on Google, but was eventually strangled by their restrictions on third-party use of their search results. Today he's going to tell us something about a book project that is in progress, and his title is Concerning a Machine Command Theory of Ethics. Thanks, Tony. Share your screen and we'll enjoy the talk and listen, be ready for questions afterwards. Oh, and let me also remind you, if you do want to ask a question, type your name into the Q&A box and we will promote you to a panelist in order to do so once we get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Colin. I appreciate that. And I'll just jump right to it. We're doing this totally virtual today because I have a cold. I hope my voice holds out all right. I have a COVID test this afternoon. We'll see how that goes. I'm not expecting a bad result. I think it's just a cold. But in any case, I want to talk today about a project I'm working on a machine command theory of ethics. And I'm not going to really lay out all of the details for that today. What I'm going to do is argue against what I call culpability models for a machine command theory of ethics. So we'll just jump right to it, and I'll see if I can get this in the time frame that we're looking at here. So, okay, the outline of the talk is, as you see it here, I'm going to talk about some preliminaries just to give some big ideas about what's going on. We'll talk about Turing's test a little bit. I want to talk about one way to get into the problem of culpability ethics. Then I want to talk a little bit about different meanings of the word ought. And then I want to talk about how all of this sets up problems and paradoxes for culpability ethics. Ultimately, to conclude that culpability ethics will not be the way to go for machine command theory. So you see the subtitle here is Against Culpability Models for a Defensible Machine Command Theory of Ethics. So we'll just jump right to it. Let me say that last night I had a session with the fellows at the center, and we talked about a lot of these themes, and there's a lot of nuance that is missing in these slides that I learned in our conversation last night. So I didn't have, of course, time to respond to all of those. So those of you who were in that conversation last night are going to hear me say things that I probably would not say if I had time to adjust things a little bit after our conversation. So part one here, preliminaries for a machine command theory of ethics. So here's the supposition. I just start with the conjecture that a properly designed AI system can perform better at determining and promulgating moral directives than human beings using conventional moral theory. Okay, I won't read all of the slides, I promise, but that was important to get out. So the bet here is that an AI system can do better than human beings with conventional moral theories at determining moral directives. Or if we wanted to soften this, depending on what we think ethics ultimately is for, it might not be determining and promulgating moral directives. It might be also a matter of using AIs to assist human beings in making moral decisions. So the project is to throw out that idea and then just ask what would make such a preposterous idea philosophically defensible. Okay, so I expect probably the initial idea of letting a machine determine moral rules is somehow going to startle some people. In fact, I know the reaction to this project over the last decade, I've kind of been working on this, has been usually negative, but as I said last night, people disagree often for very different reasons. So you may have your own reasons for taking the stance that you do. I'd love to hear objections. So I'll point out that this is a preliminary study. I have been working on this for quite some time, but I don't have details for what an MCT should be just yet. So I'm going to argue for one thing that it shouldn't be, and that's going to be this attack, really, in the philosophical sense of attack on culpability models of ethics. So whatever we're going to say about machine command theory, it's not going to be any of these. So it's not going to be a matter simply of instantiating divine command theory in a machine or natural law theory or anything like that, but it may involve pieces of all of them, okay, or some of them, or some subset, what have you. So these are off the table for various reasons. These reasons include indeterminacy. If we're going to put moral subroutines in a computer, or we're going to derive moral commands from a computer, we need something that's more definite, that's going to actually terminate in conclusive kinds of results. And none of these theories, at least if you look across the ethics literature, gives you non-controversial results on almost any topic. Well, that's not fair to say, actually. I guess on topics like murder, they're going to agree. But on any topic where there's controversy, right, we find that these theories don't issue a definitive answer. Some of them are computationally intractable in various senses of that word. If you look at something like utilitarianism, for instance, we have to see we're going to be looking for what maximizes the greatest good for the greatest part of the populace with the greatest pleasure. We don't know how far out that goes in terms of a ripple effect across time. So I might maximize your pleasure. That might help you maximize somebody else's pleasure, and so on and so forth. How far out do we follow that? Or what do we do about future states across time? How far into the future do we calculate? When we're looking at utility there, ethical egoism is the same. There's also this issue with outdated, what I'm going to call an outdated moral anthropology. And this might be a little bit of a touchy subject too. The moral anthropology that I'm really after is the kind of moral anthropology that's rooted in internal folk psychological states, mostly in terms for ethics here, in terms of desire conflicting with a sense of obligation that sets up moral freedom or moral choice, that in turn is going to allow somebody to make an immoral or moral decision. And I have a part of the presentation that will deal with that in some detail. So I think we have these three problems here. There are other problems that rule out merely instantiating existing moral frameworks into a machine for machine command theory. So we're going to need something different. Now, we could ask, what could that be? The answer, I think, depends on what ethics is needed for. And this is something that people are going to disagree on here, but by far, it seems that most people, by far, hold to some type of culpability model. That is a model of ethics that is based on categories such as moral responsibility, conscience, praise, blame, intentionality, moral worthiness, worthiness for punishment, and so on and so forth. But there are some other models that are available. One could talk about conflict resolution models of ethics. This is a model that often doesn't have a culprit, so there's no one to blame here. The goal in conflict resolution models is to bring all parties to a peaceable resolution of a conflict. So we don't need to find the culprit and kind of kick them out. And there's also some social coordination models, which I'm really attracted to for this kind of project. Social coordination models are being looked at by people in complex systems or multi-agent systems. analysis where we're looking at norm propagation across agents in a system. And there's some pretty nifty stuff going on in that particular area. So there are some other options. An option I didn't mention here is also Luciano Floridi's kind of eco-informational environmentalism, which is also a no-fault ethics that's patient-centric and not really based on FP internals. So of the three I've listed here, right, only the culpability model requires the categories of intentionality, free will, moral responsibility, conscience, and so on. So moral command theory, this is just going to be what I'm arguing for, will not involve any of these. Okay, so the question you're probably wondering about is why not? And that's going to be the bulk of the presentation. In simple form, the answer is that because I hope to show here, at least in a sketchy form, that culpability models are either ill-conceived or they have outlived their usefulness. I don't know really which way to go here, but I do have a few loose conjectures about ethics that I'll throw out here generally. So we'll just make a conjecture that ethics is about the regulation of behavior to promote human flourishing. And if that's what we're going to take ethics to be, then maybe the propensity to adopt culpability models, the propensity for us to blame, to fault find, to seek out the culprit, and so on and so forth, is an evolutionary selected mechanism that is used to diagnose and repair social problems. If that's what it is, it's a strategy for dealing with social problems and repair. It might have functioned in certain kinds of environments, and it might function less well in our environment. It might also mean that if it's a strategy or tactic for promoting or regulating behavior and promoting flourishing, that other tactics and strategies are available as well. So I'll loosely conjecture here the possibility that with the emergence of a global society, we are undergoing a morally relevant phase change in the structure of society, which makes the old framework of blaming possibly less effective. I won't go through the quotes here on the screen completely in the interest of time, but in 1982, Emmanuel Levinas wrote something very, very much to this effect. And keep in mind that this is 1982, so it's still 14 years, 12 years before the internet, World Wide Web rolls out. So we're still pretty early, but he's watching a transformation that he writes about in society in which human beings are more and more connected to each other by media forces and less connected to each other in local communities. And this is creating a world in which, as he says, it's not on the slide here, but is where this quote finishes, a world in which we find ourselves side by side rather than face to face. And I just put this out here as a case in point in which at least one person one moral philosopher has noted a phase change in the structure of society that might have moral ramifications. I'm not married to this, it's just a supposition. Also, Levinas gives us a question or an observation here in 1961 that when I first read this actually struck me as just kind of bizarre. That says something about my own bias here, and ended up being the inauguration point for my dissertation back in 1990, and has kind of stayed with me over the years. This is simple first line of his book, Totality and Infinity. Everyone will readily agree that it is of highest importance to know whether we are not duped by morality. And my own background, I'm coming from a Catholic tradition. Here, this just seemed like a foolish question initially. To be duped by morality, what are we asking here? Are we possibly fooled by the whole edifice of moral language and so on and so forth? My initial response to this was very much one of shock. And as the years have gone by, the last 30 years, and particularly the last 10, I've changed my mind a little bit about the seriousness with which this statement should be considered. I think it's possible that maybe there are some serious issues with the way we conceive of morality. So this change in my point of view started by getting introduced to machine ethics about a decade ago, and in particular in reading Colin's book on moral machines, which I'll talk about here a little bit more. And so what you're going to see here in what follows is what happens when a former Catholic or a recovering Catholic, whatever I am, reads Colin's book. So it's been a decade of assessment and reassessment to end up at the point I am today. So I'm going to start with an observation made by Anderson and Anderson. These are two people who work in machine ethics. They quote from Daniel Dennett that AI makes philosophy honest, and they go on to take an ethical reading of this, that ethics must be made computable in order to make it clear exactly how agents ought to behave in moral dilemmas. And what I take them to be saying here is something very similar to what Dennett said in his 1984 paper, Cognitive Wheels. It's a central paper in cognitive science, a very interesting paper regarding the frame problem in AI, in which Dennett says that the frame problem in AI is not just a problem for artificial intelligence and computability, it's a general problem for epistemology too. In fact, I think he said, maybe he says it's an embarrassment for epistemology. Maybe he doesn't go quite that far, but in the same way, we could say that the computability or non-computability of ethical theories, not just the computer science problem, it also poses some serious problems for moral philosophy. It might mean that we have to rearrange or rethink what moral philosophy is for. Borrowing from this, and this is tied to a particular conception of ethics. It might not be the right or most popular conception, but we could take from the observation that the Andersons have made here that any viable moral theory, even for human beings, right, is going to have to achieve engineering clarity in order to be able to arrive at a definitive decision, assuming that you think that what a moral theory is supposed to do is give us answers for how to behave in moral situations. There are other conceptions of ethics that don't quite go that way, but if you do think that the purpose of a moral philosophy or a moral theory is to terminate in definite answers about how to behave, then if you can't say how that can be determined, we have an inadequacy in our moral theory. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of follow that out, assuming this for the moment, recognizing that it might not be a complete assumption or a fair assumption. So we'll move into part two of the talk on Turing's prediction and what I call its moral corollary. And here I'm going to point out that what I'm really concerned about is changes in the way that we frame or talk about ethics because of technology. So Turing said, right famously, in 1950, I believe that at the end of the century, the use of words in generally educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. Point out, he did not say that machines would be able to think. He just says that we could talk about them as if they could think. And that signals a reframing of our understanding about what thinking might be. And I think in a similar way, we could ask now, will it be the case that by mid-century, this century, that the use of words will have changed so that we can speak of a machine as being moral without expecting to be contradicted? And that's kind of what I'd like to explore here. What's at stake if we start being able to say that robots are moral beings? Whether they are or not is beside the point. It's how we talk about them. Hope the cough drop doesn't get in the way here. So here's a couple of slides just to check our intuition a little bit. On the left panel here, you see that we've got some things that people sometimes meaningfully say. My computer thinks, my computer hates me, or my computer is good at computing. And some things that computers or people don't usually say about computers. My computer is thoughtful, it's insightful, it's wise. I've not heard that. Maybe it's been said. My computer loves me, my computer is depressed, or my computer missed me last week, or my computer is morally good, conscientious, or courageous. So these are things that on the right panel there that I don't think people typically think or say. I think if we shift the domain to robots, however, our intuitions may shift. So it seems at least possible to me today that we might one day, not in the not too far future, be able to say or want to say things like my robot is thoughtful, or it's insightful, or it's wise, or it loves me, or it's depressed, with regard to moral, that it's morally good or conscientious or courageous. Now, some reasons why that might be the case is that robots are embodied. They exhibit externally visible kinds of behaviors that we can watch, and so on and so forth. And also that's really how we judge another person's character, right? That if we're looking at their externals, that doesn't mean just what they do. It does mean also what they say. Verbal acts are also observable acts, and so on and so forth. So I think it's plausible or possible that with robots that act and behave morally and offer their justifications in words morally, that we're going to want to say that they're moral. With just a quick reminder here that Turing's test is using a behavioral criterion for indistinguishability from human behavior to decide that the machine is thinking. And so we could frame this as Wallach and Alan do in the Moral Machines book, the book that I mentioned earlier that kind of changed my take on ethics, that it's possible to maybe set a benchmark for what would constitute a moral machine by subjecting the machine to a similar test in which human beings would be unable to determine which is a human and which is a computer based on the description of behaviors offered by both parties, the human and machine. Lots of stuff has been written on the moral Turing test. I don't really want to get into the details about that argument or about whether the test is a good test or a bad test. I'm just putting it out here to suggest that at least a benchmark has been suggested by which we might want to be able to say that a machine is moral. And so this is the general view so far. I just need to get on the table here that it's not a preposterous idea that at some point someone's going to want to say that my robot is moral. If you want some other justifications for why that might be something that could happen, we might look at the way that we assess the character of fictional characters in movies and in books and so on and so forth. We do describe those characters as moral or immoral, even though they don't have any interiority or kind of mind at all. So we'll just put that out there, and I'll pass on here as one way to get into the problem. And here's a bit of a thought experiment from a paper that I wrote a decade ago. So let's just suppose that sometime in the future, we get a headline that says the first robot is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for incredible acts of courage on the battlefield. What must we assume for this headline to make sense? This is going to be our concern. Now, if you're going to say the robot acted courageously, we're going to really want to be able to say that the robot had a sense of fortitude and discipline, that it had an intention to act while experiencing fear, that it had some notion of sacrifice with regard to its own life, that it just didn't randomly just do such a thing. Because courage requires that it be a response to these kinds of circumstances. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that when it comes to our intuitions about ethics, interiority counts, unless we adopt a strictly behavioral criteria. So what I'm going to suggest here is that if we follow the computational paradigm in philosophy to make ethics honest, that we're going to end up adopting some type of behavioral criteria. And again, by the way, that could be the behavior of listening to a machine give us its reason. And I'm going to suggest that this move does not bode well for the culpability model of ethics. Okay, I suspect that the most people will not want to say that this courageously acting robot is deserving of our moral esteem. I'll leave that to you to decide. So to follow this out here, early kind of leader here in maybe a direction of moral behaviorism, though it's conflicted, is Mill. We've got the notion that actions are right in proportion as they promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure, by unhappiness is pain. So we get the classical notion of utility, and Mill says in utilitarianism that it's the business of ethics to tell us what our duties are. No system of ethics can require that our sole motive of ethics be the feeling of duty. And he says, in fact, most of the time, our moral actions are not compelled by proper motives, right? So for Mill, the morality of an action is determined by its conformity to a rule. If this is the case, then it seems that interiority does not make a moral difference for Mill. And if that's the case, then it seems that there is nothing incoherent about calling a robot moral. If a robot abides by the principle of utility, assuming that it could be computed, there seems to be nothing incoherent on Mill's platform just to call it immoral. Now, Mill goes on in utilitarianism to start to talk about conscience. I have a little trouble reconciling what he says about conscience in the latter portions of utilitarianism with what he says in the second part about the principle of utility. But he does say outright, pretty much, that conscience may wane, but obligations do not. And if that's the case, then conscience is not a necessary condition for a moral action. As you can do a moral action without any conscience, with bad conscience, with good conscience, with no conscience. I think, at least before last night, our conversation last night, that this presented a little bit of a problem for Mill. So Mill says, we do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished for it. I maybe have an overloaded definition of the word punishment here, but I take this to mean that if somebody is deserving of punishment, I slip in deserving, that this implies that they're morally culpable or they're guilty of something, that they've got an intention that's gone wrong or something. And it also implies a sense of moral responsibility. That is non-causal responsibility. I'll clarify that in just a moment. These in turn seem to imply to me, for me, that it is in an agent's power to commit or refrain committing an action that is necessary for punishment to be bestowed appropriately. And this implies in turn, that a reason for acting is irrelevant to Mill, since moral action must be evaluated on a consequentialist, that is, externalist criterion. And I think that what strikes me here as a bit incoherent for Mill is that if you're going to adopt the completely externalist criterion, you really have thrown out, or at least situated way in the background, notions of moral culpability and notions of moral responsibility. If I'm correct here, then Mill is a precursor for moral methodological behaviorism, even if his liberalism might want to make him resist this characterization. And the concern that I would like to make here or offer here is that in the process of making ethics honest, will research in machine ethics push us in the same direction? So it seems to make Mill coherent, we need to define the psychology of moral agency in such a way that conscience, moral responsibility, and accountability are sufficient but not necessary conditions for moral action, apparently while somehow preserving moral culpability. And in turn, this means that if internals do not make a moral difference, we get a series of collapsing moral distinctions that ethics historically seems to have needed. For instance, we cannot make a distinction between acting for the sake of duty versus acting in accordance with duty. Remember, we're just looking at external results. We cannot make a distinction between being good or merely acting so. This distinction was very critical for Plato and Aristotle in virtue ethics, for instance. It's actually important for Kant as well. We can't make a distinction between civic law, moral custom on the one hand, and moral law on the other hand. And importantly, and shockingly, we can't make a distinction between persons and things. That last one really bothered me the first time that occurred to me, which was in reference, by the way, to a 2004 paper by Floridi and Sanders, in which they posit an ethics that is not person-centric. It ends up not being person-centric, it's patient-centric, but your patient might also be an informational artifact. But in any case, so all four of these distinctions seem to collapse, leaving us with no way to distinguish between these kinds of statements. My toaster was responsible for my house burning down, which is a malfunction. Joe inadvertently knocked over a candle and was thus responsible for my house burning down, which is an accident. And Bob, the arsonist, purposely set fire to my house and thus was responsible for my house burning down, a transgression. So here's a way to summarize this. If interiority does not make a moral difference, then all responsibility conflates to causal responsibility. And there is no way to distinguish between moral wrongdoing on the one hand and illegal or socially inappropriate behavior on the other. To be moral is to behave according to a code of conduct. And if so, then ethics is accordingly redefined. And so we end up with a situation where the toaster is the littlest arson. If we were in a crowd, this usually, this little moment gets a laugh. I can't believe I actually found that last image online. But so the allegation made at this particular point is that if we lose our interiority, our moral interiority here, and by that I mean senses of conscience, guilt, moral compulsion, or what have you, we don't have a way to distinguish between mere behavior that's merely agreement with a code of conduct or ethical behavior. And by the way, I should point out that even outside of machine ethics, in the general sphere of ethics, there's a push in this direction, right? I mean, several of us are going to be working for institutions where we have ethics statements that are put out, and that ethics statement is titled a code of conduct, and that is passed off as one way to be ethical. That used to bother me a lot. That doesn't bother me so much so now. So maybe there's some truth in that part of the presentation. We can talk about it in the Q&A. If the question of interiority has not been is not reaching deeply enough, then I think by turning to Kant, we can get a little bit of a deeper understanding of what we need for moral culpability to be the case. And so I'm going to talk about two different meanings of ought. These are by no means innovative on my part. They've been discussed widely in the literature, and there are more than two different meanings of ought. Again, I'll start with just a nice quote from Emmanuel Levinas about about an essay. It starts an essay, on the Garden of Eden scene in the Hebrew scriptures. So the drama of existence is not merely that we are divided between choices and desires, but that existence is suspended between the law that is given me of my nature, which is incapable of submitting to the law without constraint. It is not freedom which defines the human being, it is obedience which defines them. And I just put this quote out here to situate us in the context of a moral problematic that permeates the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's also present in other religious traditions. And I have a suspicion that this conception of moral interiority has seeped out of religion and is part of our general moral discourse today. That's something that we might discuss in the Q&A. So we could talk about different kinds of situations we find ourselves in. We can have, excuse me, a preferential dilemma, which is a dilemma between two conflicting wants. Maybe choosing chocolate and vanilla at the ice cream counter. Or we could have a moral dilemma. And this is a choice between what I want to do and what I ought to do. And in this moral dilemma, the ought is at odds with the want. Okay, so it's a direct contradiction to the want that puts me in a situation where I have to decide between what I want and what is the right thing to do. So I need this collision between the want and the ought to have the moral dilemma that is going to open up my freedom to make a moral choice. So it's a different kind of dilemma than just trying to figure out what kind of car I want to buy. By the way, I should point out, in case you're framing an objection here, that many preferential dilemmas, if you think about them enough, they turn out to be moral dilemmas too. Maybe if you're trying to pick between chocolate and vanilla at the ice cream counter, and the chocolate is farmed by slaves in some country, that might change the moral standing of chocolate, and that might change the nature of that dilemma. I'm not denying that. So I'm just trying to assert here the possibility of two different kinds of dilemmas, a preferential choice between things that are neither moral nor immoral, and the kind of collision between what I want and what ought to be the case that frames moral dilemmas. And this is nicely articulated and often misunderstood, I think, in Kant. I know that this is a common moment in the grounding for the metaphysics of morals to pull out here. I actually think it's really profound, though I don't, I think it's really profound at getting to our intuitions about ethics. And when we understand what Kant is doing here, that basically this little exercise is right, though I'm not sure I want to buy Kant on all fronts. But he notes basically trying to get us to concede that the idea of morality coincides with our idea of duty. He sets up particular kinds of cases. The first one we don't need to worry about, case 0 or case 1, right? We can just put them aside. But it's case 2, 3, and 4 that concerns us here. So you can imagine in case 2 situation, it might look something like this. I'm driving down the road and I see my boss has a flat tire beside the road, and I pull over to help my boss change the tire. I also know that performance appraisals are coming up this week, and I want a good performance appraisal. So my motive in helping my boss change the tire is that I want the good performance appraisal. And in Kant's view here, what's going to make this immoral is that I am in a way using my supervisor as an instrument to get what I want, rather than respecting my supervisor as a person. In the case 3 situation, I want to stop and help my supervisor with the flat tire, but that's because I'm nice. I like doing this. It makes me somehow satisfied to do this. It's in my nature, I guess we should say, to do this. So in case 3, my natural disposition coincides with my moral obligation. And much to the surprise of first-time readers of the grounding, Kant says that this is an amoral case. I'll explain in a moment here what's counterintuitive about that initially. And then he presents the option that might go like this. This is not Kant's example, it's mine, but let's say I hate my supervisor. I don't want to do anything to help my supervisor. I could get away if I just drove past and didn't help my supervisor change the tire, but I stop anyway. For those who were part of the discussion last night, this might be the morally acting psychopath that we were discussing. Now, the surprising thing that students usually react to is, as we try to pass this off is that it looks like Kant is saying, he's not saying this, I don't think. It looks like Kant is saying that the case 4 person is more moral than the case 3 person. And what's counterintuitive about that is the person who does not want to do their duty, is not inclined to do their duty, and does it anyway, is a more moral person than someone who has a natural inclination to do their duty. I don't think that's really what Kant is getting at here. I think what he's trying to do is simply align the notion of morality with duty. And in fact, we know from other texts that he actually thinks being a case 3 person is a better way to be. Case 3 person is a better way to be because case 3 doesn't need an ethics at all. Case 3 people are not in the situation of the moral dilemma that we looked at here. So if they're not in the moral dilemma, all the better for them, right? So when we consider what we have here, we see that Kant is making a distinction between this clash between inclinations and obligations that doesn't bother Mill. So as far as Mill's appraisal of what would constitute a moral action would be, cases 2, 3, and 4 are all morally equivalent. Okay. So basically what this suggests is that the moral dilemma, that's the, I have here on the right as the A2 dilemma, is kind of classically framed as the collision between what I want and a countervailing obligation against what I want. And then the situation where I have a justified want and I simply have no dilemma. And another way to look at this is that a person who's in case 3, not only do they not have a dilemma, they actually don't have any moral freedom either. Moral freedom is what happens when a choice opens up, when there's a collision between a want and an ought. So the case 3 person without the dilemma also is not morally free in that particular context. You could take that back and use that as a pretense for rereading Genesis 3. Makes kind of an interesting reading of Genesis 3. But at least for our purposes here, we have the possibility in Kant of an agent that can be a well-behaving agent that does not accord moral praise for doing so. They are an amoral agent. And as the grounding unfolds, so this is in part 1 of the grounding, but as you get into the second part of the grounding, different kinds of agents for Kant pop out, and they all tie back to this dilemma here. I'll say to the side, by the way, that I used to think that Kant was fair when Kant says he's not dragging in any anthropology for his ethics. I actually think he is now. I think this view that we're looking at here is a piece of religious architecture that's assumed by Kant way in the background that kind of creeps into his ethics. So here's what we have coming from Kant. We can have an agent that is driven solely by its inclination, such as an animal. Animals are not moral agents or morally responsible or morally culpable for Kant here, or we can have agents also that act solely out of reason, such as angels, he says, and these angels don't have a moral ought at all either. For them, the ought is a would, Kant says in the English translations of the grounding here. So beings 1 and 2 are they each occupy different directions, but neither have a moral dilemma, and neither can be praised or blamed for their moral actions. Then we've got our case 3 beings, beings that are so constituted that their inclinations always accord with duty, perfect human beings. We have case 4 beings here, beings with inclinations that at least some of the time disagree with duty, but who nonetheless do what they're supposed to do. So they're not inclined in the right direction, but they do it anyway. And we have those early low-level beings that have inclinations that sometimes disagree with duty, but do what they want without regard for duty. Okay, so those are going to be our case 1 and case 2 people in the previous chart. Now here's where the problem comes in, And I think this gets to the problem of moral interiority that we were discussing last night. Maybe clarify a little bit more about how deep I think moral interiority has to get for ethics. So here's what I think we need our moral agents to be. We need them to be I've marked it here as 4 prime. These are beings with inclinations that at least some of the time disagree with duty, but who nonetheless follow the dictates of duty, even though it is possible for them not to. And it's this last little part that I have italicized here that's particularly bothersome, at least on a Kantian architecture here. In order for an agent to be morally responsible, praiseworthy, or blameworthy for that matter, it must be possible for them not to do the right thing. And this possibility of not doing the right thing is what seems to be getting down to the guts of that full psychological moral interiority that I was discussing here. And I'm asking whether this is morally or logically coherent, because this becomes the case. If you want to build a robot and have the robot be a moral agent, right? You don't want to add the possibility that it could do harm as a condition for making it responsible. That seems to be irresponsible. That is to intentionally design robots that could move around in the world and could possibly do harm, and to do so just solely so we could say that the robot was capable of being a moral agent. So what we want our moral agents to be are beings so constituted that their inclinations always accord with duty. That is, we want them to be those case 3 agents that we were looking at earlier, that are not in moral dilemmas, that don't have a collision between a want and an ought, because they're so inclined to always do the right thing. And so we're going to want our moral agents to be made this way. And so we want moral robots that are on a Kantian platform designed to be good, in which case they could not pass the courage test that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, nor could they experience the moral dilemma that creates the necessary situation for moral choice that would allow them to be held responsible and accountable for their actions. They would not be, in other words, moral beings. Okay, and this is, of course, if Kant's characterization of the moral situation is right. I actually want to broaden that out just a little bit and suggest here, it's not just Kant's characterization, right? I think it's Augustine's characterization of the moral situation. I think it's in Aquinas. I think it's in Plato and Aristotle as well. And I think it's this point is debatable. I think it's in our kind of folk understanding of the nature of moral situations. Now, I need to say a little bit to the side on that. That might be my Catholicism talking. I think last night in our conversation, I learned that not everybody, maybe not even most people, have this kind of characterization of what it means to be morally responsible or morally accountable. I'd be curious to test this and see whether this is built into those of us who were raised in particular religious traditions, and those who disagree were raised in different religious traditions. I'm not sure about that, but ultimately, what I think this means, and this part 5 will wrap things up here. So here are the problems and paradoxes for culpability models of ethics, with a particular eye toward machine command theory. So traditionally understood, ought implies can. That is Kant, right? Kant never says ought implies can, but usually that view is attributed to him. If that's the case, then ought does not imply must, and therefore it implies might not. So to say that I ought to do something as opposed to I have to do it or I must do it is to say that I might not do it. I might fail in this obligation. Ought seems to imply implementability. That's an argument that needs to be spelled out in more detail than I've spelled out here, but it's not salient immediately for the point that I want to make. The point that I really want to make here is that ought implies moral interiority, and this is spelled out in the section 4 of the talk. Moral interiority seems to require, at least how I want to define it. This is a little bit, I should have said this last night. A desire that is challenged on the basis of some X, wherever that's coming from, a moral theory, a divine command, conscience, what have you. Thus, a moral dilemma that enables moral freedom, that makes my actions worthy of praise or blame, that makes me able to account for them, and hence makes me responsible for them. And if this is not the case, this third category of things is not the case here, the moral interiority category, then merely appearing or acting good is sufficient and necessary for our judgment that an action is morally justified. And the result is what I call moral behaviorism, a kind of moral behaviorism. So this seems to present, if you accept that conception of morality, this seems to leave us with a paradox that having a culpability model will offer us. So if we're going to build autonomous machines, these are machines that make their own decisions. So they're out running around in the world, making decisions based on input. We would seem to have an obligation to try to make them responsible, I think. For agent to be responsible and to be able to be held responsible for its actions, it must be capable of both succeeding and failing in its obligations. An automated moral agent that is also a responsible moral agent must therefore be designed or minimally allowed to be capable of both succeeding and failing. It would be a moral failure to unleash upon the world machines that are capable of failing in their moral obligations. We certainly don't want to design them so they can fail simply so that we can say they're responsible. Therefore, in direct contradiction to the first premise here, we have a moral obligation to build AMAs that are not also RMAs. Okay, I need to really take a careful look at the first premise here, and maybe this will come up in the Q&A to see whether or not that really holds. But if that holds good, it seems to me that the way out of the paradox seems to be either one of these two. It is either just flat out immoral to build autonomous machines. And by the way, there are people who argue that. More than a few in the machine ethics literature. You just can't do this because there's nobody to blame. Or there's nobody to blame if they fail. Or in the second case, we just need another model for ethics, one that's not culpability based. So if we are going to build autonomous machines, which is perhaps inevitable, then we seem to need another model for ethics. Off to the side here, I'll go ahead and put this out. I do see the time. I've been working with Marcello Guarini on a possible project here, and this is on the possibility of preserving culpability models as interpretive strategies. I think there's a possibility that what we've said so far is that a culpability model might be an interpretive strategy for regulating social behavior, and that it might work in some cases, or it might even, as an interpretive strategy, be able to be updated in such a way that it works better than it's working now. That's to the side of the machine ethics question. But on the presentation side here, given that I'm seeking a philosophically defensible machine command theory of ethics, that the machine that MCT runs on must be an autonomous machine, and that its pronouncements, if they're pronouncements at all, must be thought of as moral, then MCT cannot be based on a culpability model of ethics, and we need another model for ethical decision making. A preliminary guess of what that might look like is the social coordination model that I mentioned earlier. These are being looked at again in norm propagation models in multi-agent systems, where in this case, MCT might be functioning as a regulator for determining or helping to determine which norms get propagated. If you want to see an interesting kind of early paper on norm propagation with a central executive, this paper by Morris Martin et al. Is actually kind of interesting in that regard. Two concerns I have, and then I'll be finished here. My worries, and I'm still seriously bothered by this. What is ethical about ethics without its full psychological internals. That is, how does ethics differ from any other decision procedure if you take out responsibility, praise and blame, culpability, conscience, so on and so forth? Is ethics really just compliance with a justifiable code of conduct after all? No, I realize we have to quibble over what justifiable means in the code of conduct. Or if we wanted to frame this positively rather than negatively, as I have it here, might it be possible that there are better models for the regulation of behavior that do social diagnostics and repair that do so without culpability models? I'm not sure what to make out of that. And then there's kind of a sneaking worry that I have that I might have confused the epistemic problem of determining what constitutes moral behavior with the metaphysical, psychological problem of moral motivation. I'm not sure the extent to which those two are actually separable questions. They're certainly not for Kant, but I don't really quite know where to go with that. So that's what I have. Thank you for listening, and I'm curious to see what you might have to say about it. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Tony. I have to thank you on behalf of everybody because their applause is inaudible to us. But thank you for that interesting talk. We have about 23 to 24 minutes for questions. Already some questions lined up here. So while I promote people to the position where they can ask the question, Marcelo, you're going to be first. Also, let me remind everybody else that if you wish to ask a question, just put your name in the Q&A box and I will promote you to a panelist. So Marcelo, welcome. Good to see you. Please turn on your microphone at least and ask your question to Tony.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you, Tony. Oh.
Yeah. Hey, Marcelo.
Hey. I just lost all video here. Just give me a second. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I can't see you, but I can hear you, so that'll do. All right. So again, thanks for that. And yeah, I just had a question about culpability as it relates to scenarios where mens rea or bad intent is not relevant. So for example, manslaughter cases where you can be found guilty for an offense, even though there's no intention to do anything wrong. So for example, somebody gets in their car, they say, George, he's driving, kids are in the back seat, he doesn't buckle them in. And one of the kids gets up and thinks, okay, I'm going to do something funny to daddy, puts his hands on George's eyes, and George is like, stop that, gets into a car accident, kills someone. In many jurisdictions, George can be found guilty for involuntary manslaughter. There was no intent to kill. There's not that kind of interiority there. So where do these kinds of culpability, and it's a form of culpability without negative intent. So I agree with you that we shouldn't design machines that intentionally have the ability to want to do bad things or even be tempted to do bad things. But one way of construing what went wrong with George is that that there's an epistemic failure. He didn't do the necessary causal reasoning to realize that by not strapping in his kids, he was creating an unacceptable level of risk. So if you look at it from a systems perspective, one reason for, say, holding George culpable and not holding a toaster culpable is George is actually capable of engaging the practice of holding culpable can impact someone's reasoning in a way that modifies their behavior. There's no way of, there's no deterrent for a toaster. It's not capable of engaging in that kind of reasoning. So there's a kind of epistemic failure there and a way of holding culpable that could impact someone's reasoning for the better. No matter how well we design a robot, I mean, it's not going to be omniscient, right? So I guess what I'm wondering is, could there be some reason for, say, designing a system that holds the robot culpable? Obviously, it would have to be capable of being concerned about what happens to it in some sense. Again, it doesn't have to be some phenomenological thing. It could be a functional behavioral concern for its own activities, whether it'll be restricted or not in that kind of way. And again, from that systems perspective, might it make a kind of sense to say, no, we're going to hold robots at a certain level of sophistication, i.e. those that can reason about their own behavior in very complicated ways, culpable because there's some deterrent value to doing so, because no matter how well we design them, we want to incentivize them to engage in the right kinds of behaviors. Might that make a kind of sense? It's a kind of culpability, but not one that's premised on, negative intent or mens rea or anything like that. Yeah.
And I actually think this came up in our conversation last night too, that I may need to talk about two different kinds of culpability here, one way around it. So I think there's a really rich kind of moral culpability. The other kind of legal culpability to incentivize, maybe the best way for me to respond to that is by looking at reasons why we might incarcerate. Okay, so you can look at, we could put somebody in jail because they committed a moral transgression, or we could put somebody in jail because we can't have people like this running around loose on the street. We could put people in jail to set a precedent to discourage people from engaging in certain kinds of behavior. That seems to me that's a different use of the word culpability. I don't know if that's going to be entirely satisfying, but I think when you bring in the legal cases, I'm more inclined to say I'm okay with following that tack. That's why I think on the project you and I are working on, that this talk doesn't kill that project. Yeah. But does that satisfy?
Yeah, I think what's happened in the legal domain actually has gone well past certain traditional liberal conceptions of culpability that come out of people like Kant, right? Especially when you start looking at things like felony murder, and we've essentially said intent doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's really when I've taught legal philosophy and start explaining to students the extent to which intent doesn't matter on a lot of these really harsh crimes that we'll punish people for, it's shocking to them. Right.
So Tony and Marcello, in order to give a chance to everybody else, I think we should move on. But thanks very much for the question. And obviously, you two have a lot to talk about with your project. Yeah, great, thanks. So next up, I've got Connor Prow. If you'd unmute yourself.
Hey, Connor.
Hi, Doc. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Alrighty. Yeah. So this question's actually somewhat related to that. So I was thinking when you were talking about this sort of folk conception we have of culpability and our moral considerations, if that's the correct way of framing it. It seems to me a lot of the times this commitment we have to a culpability model of ethics is at least perpetuated, maybe not originating in, but perpetuated, I think, by these punitive measures we have with our prison systems and things like that. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that interacts with holding robots accountable. I mean, obviously, as we pointed out already, you can't really, perhaps there's ways to hold a robot accountable in ways that are similar to punishing them and restricting them. But I was wondering about how that sort of, how you might think change overall and the way that we think about punitive punishment might be necessary in moving toward this non-culpability model.
Well, this is partly why I'm inclined to go that way for machine ethics, especially. I kind of want to jettison the question of accountability entirely and use more of a diagnostic model. So if the robot fails, obviously we can't have it running around loose on the street. Okay, so it needs to be turned off or something needs to be done. Blaming the robot, though we might have a kind of a psychological propensity to want to do that, doesn't seem to do anything either. So the purpose of the project is generally to throw out the notion of accountability as at least accountability in a really strong sense, so that we can see the morally dysfunctional robot as an engineering problem that we need to deal with. Does respond to what you're saying?
Yeah, it does.
I think, yeah, okay.
Great, thank you. So next up, Justin, welcome.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey JP.
Hey Doc. So I fear you've sort of answered the couple of questions I have here already, so I apologize if I'm being a bit redundant, but I'll just go ahead and preface it with saying I don't know a ton about social coordination or conflict resolution models. So maybe the question stems from a sort of ignorance of how those actually operate. But without further ado, so my question really is, can we really remove or get around notions of praise or blame in these models as you may have described them here? So from my sort of surface level understanding, it seems like social coordination, if it is, as you suggested, sort of propagating norms, then this does sort of imply still that certain norms ought not to be propagated. And thus they are wrong in some sense. And if you commit them, you're at some fault for committing them. Similarly, with conflict resolution, is there not an implication that a conflict is something to be avoided? And if you happen to be in one, you find yourself in one for whatever reason, you've committed some wrong and are at least partially responsible. So I guess in short, how do we intelligibly separate these notions despite the fact that they seem still to be baked into these other models? But again, it may just be an ignorance of how they get detailed.
No, it's not at all. It's actually, this is a really good question. I don't doubt that you can bring a culpability model of ethics to any other model of ethics and use it to interpret the other kinds of ethics. I don't deny that at all. The question is going to ultimately be, if you have a social coordination model of ethics, what you gain by bringing the culpability talk in. Okay, so it might surely be the case, especially if it turns out that culpability models are interpretive strategies, right? That of course you can interpret all of the behavior in any of these models that way, but what does that add? I think that's going to be the ultimate question. So to sketch this though just a little bit, that might help. So in the paper that I cited here from the norm MAS people, that particular model has an oracle in it, and any of the agents can approach the oracle with a moral recommendation, and the oracle explores the implications of the recommendation and determines on the basis of those implications whether or not it's something that should propagate or not propagate. That's kind of how that's done, and that could be done in a you can imagine that decision about whether to propagate this norm or not propagate this norm not being done on a culpability kind of model even, but just looking at what promotes here, what will promote human flourishing and what will not promote human flourishing. So I take it that the culpability model strategy is this: find the culprits, reform the culprits, or kick the culprits out, and you can solve the moral problem. That's generally where I think culpability models really have their play. And they wouldn't have that play in these other models. So no, it's a very good observation. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope I responded to it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Justin. So we have at least a couple more questions, and if there's time, I might squeeze one in, but there's still time to put your name on the queue potentially. Next up, Boris Grozdanov. I hope I didn't butcher your name too badly.
Not at all. Thank you very much for letting my question. Great talk, very interesting. I have a couple of comments and one question. First, I completely agree with you when you said that actually we can get modality, the possibility of not being the case out of the situation when we talk about ought and obligations. But my question concerns the fourth pointed paradoxes slides, when you were quite rightfully skeptical, and I'm skeptical as well, when you talk about potential danger of unleashing robots which are capable of failing to meet the obligations, if I remember that correctly. So it seems to me that it might be regarded as a bit of a really strict requirement. For example, I don't think that we meet very often this requirement as applied to humans. we are all around us. We see unleashed humans, which more or less fail to meet the obligations. And if we take this as a strict requirement, perhaps we can get the humans back. And on the other hand, what about scenarios where objective impossibility makes it sort of impossible for a robot to take an action which eliminates at all failing, for example, trolley kind of problems and the like? Thank you.
No, I think, first of all, the modality issue here about having to preserve the possibility of failure is really kind of peculiar. I don't even know really how to think about the kind of the epistemology of a possibility here as a requirement for moral autonomy. So I'll throw that out. I think, yeah, especially if what we're going to want to say is that we're going to build this possibility into machines solely so that we can say that they're moral. That doesn't bode well for me. And I think that means that there's something wrong with our notion of moral. That something's wrong with the culpability model. I'm thinking, it's funny how willy-nilly we get on some of this. So the thing that's been on my mind, and I think about unleashing robots that could potentially do harm, or even knowing in advance that there might possibly do harm. I'm really struck by Kyle Rittenhouse's mother here in the United States. If you're following this case, she drove a 17-year-old with a rifle to a riot. And this strikes me as a situation where, this is kind of foreseeable, that something could go wrong, and so on and so forth. And so, I think if we're on a culpability model, that modality, that modal possibility is in a way binding. But I'll be honest with you that I really need to sit down and figure out how to work this notion of modality into the broader MCT framework. Now, having said that, I have a feeling you asked another question that I didn't respond to.
The second one was, how about situations where a robot is pretty much in a situation of objective impossibility not to fail?
Right. So there's no really right answer. And I think what I'd like to propose here is that we get blame and praise out of the picture here, and this is an engineering problem. I don't know how to solve trolley problems. I won't even begin to go down that pike. But I think that a robot, it's designed always to do what the right thing is. So it has whatever subroutines are necessary for making it do what it can as best as it can. When it finds itself in a situation where there's no right answer, you could take the kind of classic argument that the right answer is the least wrong answer. But I don't think culpability really is the question here. I think the question is, what's the nature of the contingencies of the world in which the robot's needing to move around in, and how do we create a world in which the robot can move around in safely to minimize the number of these occurrences that come up. I don't think we can eliminate them.
Yeah, I agree with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Heather, you're up next.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for the talk. Twice in 24 hours, we get to talk about this stuff. I wanted to ask more about this issue of robots failing, because it seems like, ever since HAL, we know robots, even that are programmed, we think properly, can fail really catastrophically. And I don't think they've gotten better at having robots actually navigate like two simultaneous goals. They seem to need to have a rank ordering for it to work. Colin can correct me if I'm wrong there, but it seems like otherwise you end up with really weird effects and gaming. So it seems like we can have robots fail without having to put in bad intent, which I think, is good for your account. And so this kind of leads to a couple different questions. One is, how do you actually deal with the fact that we can't have just a rank ordering of goals? It's really unclear what any sort of rank ordering of goals would be, but ethics is very often about navigating competing equally weighty things at the same time, that this is sort of like part of the human condition? And does this mean, on the one hand, that when we talk about moral machines, we should think of it as the same as smartphones? They're not really smart. We know our phones are dumb and we get frustrated with them, but it's smarter than most other phones. And maybe the machine is more moral than most other machines, but it's not really moral. It's just kind of, it's metaphorical when we use it that way. Or do we have to make the world safe for robots and put beacons on all of us so autonomous vehicles can safely navigate the streets because we don't want the robots to fail? What ends up being the space of trying to deal with the complications of failure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if it were up to me and I didn't have to follow the argument, maybe I do have some more latitude here. My solution would be that there's two different kinds of ethics. There's ethics for human beings, which are born in the kind of existential condition of affectivity and embedded in a culture and a tribe and so on and so forth. And another kind of ethics for machines. What I like about that is I would love to be able to hold on to the rich moral heritage that's been handed down and developed over the course of human evolution, provided that it's not causing more damage. That's the thing that I kind of trip over. But I go back and forth. What has pushed me to maybe go so far as to push the human ethics off the table and take the robot model and put it on human beings too, is that I worry about how bad human beings are at blame ascription. So Martel and I were dealing with some papers on this, and it seems that people are just really bad at determining when you blame somebody for a failing and when you see the need to correct somebody for an innocent failure or something like that. So I think the question of failing is separate from the question of culpability. And again, I might need two definitions of failing: morally failing and then instrumentally failing as well. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Did that answer enough of what you?
I do want to ask, what should we do in the face of the problem of competing goals? Should we, again, practice? Because we have machines that are trying to be moral already, like in the world doing things. Should we make the world safe for them, or should we manage their intervention in the world differently? Like, what's the?
This is interesting. I think that's fair, and I think ultimately, I'll tell you what I think is going to happen, and it's that we'll do a little bit of re-engineering the world to make the robots safe. I think I didn't actually go so far as to imagine putting beacons on us, but that would solve some problems.
We're currently funding studies into it right now in the Build Back Better program. It put a big chunk of money into that very thing. Colin told me about this, and it's true.
I think having a world that's safe with robots in it is going to require re-engineering the world a little bit too. And what I'm doing actually in the presentation is maybe re-engineering the concepts that surround some of this as well, so that we can make better robots.
So this allows me to slip in very quickly my question, which is, you talk about a prima facie duty to build these machines which could serve in this MCT, moral command theory role, but I'm wondering whether that's contingent on technology. So maybe with the technology we have no duty to do this. With some future technology, we might. And if it means actually this kind of re-engineering where every pedestrian bicyclist out there has to have a chip in them in order to make the machines work, doesn't that duty disappear?
Well, I think it disappears as a moral obligation, but it doesn't disappear as a philosophical necessity. So what I think about the MCT project is, okay, maybe this is 50 years premature, right? But my concern is that if we don't start now thinking about how this might be done, that machines are going to be rolled out that do this with no theoretical framework behind them. And so, you and I have talked a little bit about this. So the Delphi notion, you kind of roll out Moral Oracle 1.0, and it's producing bad results since you roll out 1.2. And what I worry about if there's no kind of moral framework to guide this initiative. Okay, so I don't know the people personally that are involved here, so maybe they've got a philosopher on their team or an ethicist on the team, but if they don't, they just keep trying until they get something that's publicly acceptable, then we don't really have a robust way of anticipating the possible problems. So there is a way in which I could soften the argument that MCT is a must-do project into one that might be more preventative, just in case. Does that answer your?
Yeah, that's good. Obviously, plenty more to discuss, but we're in fact out of time. So let me thank you again. This is the point that if we were live, I would be handing you an umbrella. So you're just going to have to take a rain check on that. Applause from those of us that you can see, and I'm sure virtually from the others. And just to say to everybody that the next talk is November 30th, Tuesday, is a fully online talk too, because it's the next in the former fellows talk series. So we're being joined remotely for that. So have a good break, everybody, and we will talk to you soon.